Hello, this is Gaurav Kapoor from Newristics, and this is MasterClass number 3 as part of our behavior webinar series, which teaches pharmaceutical market researchers and marketers how to apply behavioral science to their brands. Welcome to the class. Every class is 30 minutes, and in every class we cover 2 specific heuristics and biases and teach people how to understand that heuristic, how to detect it in their disease state or condition, and how to use it in market research and marketing. So let's get started. Just very quickly, if there are new people joining us, Behavior is a 30-minute monthly masterclass series. And we've deliberately designed this to be very short but highly actionable. During each class, we teach 2 standalone heuristics and biases. So if you can't join one class and can join the next month, that's totally fine. You will learn something no matter what, whether you attend every class or you attend only one class at in a whole given year. The focus of this masterclass series is to a lot of people know and understand, or at least know something about behavioral science. But what they struggle with is on how to use it on a tangible brass tacks level for their brand or in their disease state. And that's what the purpose of this masterclass series is, to make the application of behavioral science easier for you, make it more intuitive for you to understand and apply it to day-to-day marketing and market research activities. Just very quickly, we already talked about how we'll cover 2 heuristics or biases in each 30-minute class. We'll show you how those heuristics will use. The entire class is taught by using examples. So we'll use examples from different medical conditions or different disease states, how physicians or patients are influenced by that heuristic or bias, and how they make somewhat irrational decisions as a result of using that heuristic. We will teach you how to feed or fight that heuristic depending on your brand and your marketing strategy. Sometimes you will be feeding or encouraging a certain behavior or a certain decision, a heuristic or bias. Other times you will have to undo it because that's the right thing to do for your brand. So we'll show you examples of how to do that and very tangibly kind of also guide you on how to do that for your brand. At the end we'll keep a few minutes for you to ask questions. A goal is that at the end of this 30 minutes, you have enough information to start using this heuristic literally today, which could be a very ambitious goal, but so far we've been able to achieve that. So the first heuristic of this class is background contrast effect. So let's introduce what this is. It's by definition, as you can see, it's an effect on your decision making, which can, depending on when and how you use this heuristic to make decisions in life, it can sometimes lead you to make wrong or bad or irrational decisions as well. So let's, what is background contrast effect? What background contrast effect means is that sometimes how we respond to something in life, it could be a product, it could be a situation, it could be a choice or even a person, is highly dependent on what's in the background. So and theoretically or rationally, if you're evaluating something, you should just evaluate it on the merits of that product, of that person, of that concept or idea, whatever you're looking at. What's in the background should rationally not affect your thinking at all. But it does, and sometimes it does so much that you can actually make even irrational decisions. So let's look at some examples of how background contrast effect affects decision making. So the NBA Finals just finished, and Golden State Warriors won again. A lot of people talk about LeBron James, and depending on how you frame up his success and what you put in the background, you can walk away with a very different conclusion about how good or not so good or great or the greatest of all time player he is. There are only 2 players who have been to 5 NBA finals in the last 5 years. He's one of them. And the other one is a player who has actually played with LeBron James in Cleveland Cavaliers and at Miami Heat. So you can say his influence has actually helped the other guy as well. On the other hand, in the same last 5 years, he's won only one trophy. So clearly, he's an incredible athlete, and he's not only broken records, created records of all kinds, etc. But background contrast effect is a good example here, because how you can naysayers of LeBron James could very easily use a different background and present information and data or argument in a way so that make you believe he's not as good a player, or the opposite, which is make you believe he's the best player ever. That's an everyday example, timely example that that actually illustrates this effect. Now we're going to get closer. Every time we use examples, we start outside of pharmaceutical industry, and then we actually narrow in more and more into pharma. So here's an example. In hepatitis C, one of the brands that has kind of almost revolutionized hep C treatment is Harvoni. And this is the physician HCP creative campaign for Harvoni. So you can literally go on their website right now, and you'll be able to see their HCP kind of landing page has this message. Focus on the right-hand side first. If you just look at the words, be the one who can change what's possible. If that's the idea that you want to communicate, you're basically trying to say to the hepatologist or the infectious disease specialist who are treating hep C that you can now be the one who can change what's possible in hep C. If you now wanted to bring this idea to life, or significantly amplify what the words are trying to communicate, the creative imagery that has been chosen is very interesting, in that with Albert Einstein in the background, be the one who can change what's possible actually has a very different meaning now. Albert Einstein has nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with hep C. Frankly, you can even argue if Albert Einstein is a great example of somebody who can change what's possible. It's actually a better example of somebody who you would think is quote unquote genius. And maybe that's the intent, to kind of associate that imagery with Harvoni. But this is an example of background contrast effect being used to really change the meaning of what the message itself is saying. And we can all have our opinions on whether it is changing the meaning in a good or a bad way, etc. But it's an application of background contrast effect. Since we are talking about Harvoni and hep C, let's go further, and let's take a competitor to Harvoni. So staying with hep C, on the top on this page, what you see is an example of a message for a brand for hep C. The bottom is an alternative version of that message that has now been constructed using background contrast effect. And we introduced this terminology earlier in the class, on one of the slides, feed or fight the heuristic. So if the heuristic that you are playing with is background contrast effect, and you want to feed it, what that means is you want to create a background to place your brand's benefit against, in contrast against, that significantly benefits your brand. So you are creating an effect in people's minds that can actually get them to appreciate your brand's benefit more than they would have otherwise if you didn't have that background. Product X demonstrated 94% SVR rate in patients who have previously failed treatment on Harvoni. That's a message that, that's a very straightforward message that just describing one of your clinical efficacy endpoints. Now you can re-articulate this message, and this is only one example of how you could do it. Everybody on this call, if you were to now try to take a shot at yourself, applying background contrast effect, now that you know what that heuristic is, now you're trying to rewrite this message in a way so that you can amplify its impact. You can make it by feeding background contrast effect, by creating a background that didn't exist before. One example could be when Harvoni failed, you still need a cure. So if you're a physician treating Hep C today, it has kind of come to, it's becoming an expectation that you will cure the patient now. The patient walks in the door increasingly with that expectation. And so therefore, if you can't cure the patient with Haroni, you still need to find a way to cure that patient. And now the same data, the same information, 94% SVR rate, is being presented, but with a different background, it can have a different impact. Let's try another example. This is similar setup. There's a message on the top. There's a message now at the bottom, which is driven more by background contrast effect. You can say if this is the message has been heuristicized with background contrast effect. So let's see how here the language has been changed to, again, feed background contrast effect, create a background that leverages you or advantages you in a way that you couldn't do it before. Product X is a sustainable treatment, allowing patients to stay on therapy. Patients were just as likely to continue on the Product S regimens as the comparators and were actually able to receive treatment longer. Now, working with background contrast effect, how might you rewrite this message? Your treatment efforts are wasted if patients can't stay on treatment. Patients were able to receive treatment longer with Product X than any comparator and were as likely to continue. So again, by creating a background for what you want to say, which is artificially created or generated, you are now changing the way they're going to respond or assess the core information that you're trying to. The core information you're trying to communicate is that patients on Product X were able to stay or be able to receive treatment longer. That's really the most important piece of communication you are trying to communicate in this, because the other claim is a parity claim, which is they were able to continue treatment as well or as likely as comparator. So you want to emphasize where you could do it better than comparator, and that's the most important thing to communicate. But using background contrast effect in clever ways, it can change your the impact of what you're trying to say and make it sound more compelling and cut through to the customer and nudge them towards your brand. So these are examples of background contrast effect heuristic. We'll talk about where and how to use it in your disease state in a few more slides. Let's do the next heuristic first. So this is a heuristic that some or many of you might know about. You intuitively know about this, or you may have read it in a book if you read on behavioral science. Well, so we'll go a little deeper on this heuristic in terms of how it affects decision-making in disease states so that you can more actionably use it. So if you know what it is, the focus here is on how to learn how to use it. For those who are new to it, let's just introduce it first. Optimism bias. What is optimism bias? It's a bias that makes you want to be more optimistic at times in your life than you really should be. And there are times when you are irrationally optimistic, when you really should be pessimistic about your chances of something happening or not happening. But for whatever reasons, you are irrationally optimistic. There are multiple ways optimism bias manifests itself in our lives. And we're giving you kind of just, kind of ways to detect it we all have it. There's almost, I would be shocked if anybody in this class doesn't have optimism bias at all. They would be like a super rational automaton. But the way you will find this creeping into your life is you expect the future to be more optimistic or more positive, things work out for you more in the future than they have for you in the past. And all the data, all the anecdotes even might suggest that there's nothing that is going to change that situation in the future, but in your mind, you expect better outcomes in the future than you have seen consistently for many, many years or decades even in the past. Another way it manifests itself is when you compare yourself, when you think about yourself and when you think about others, your chances of having cancer, of having a heart attack, of having an accident, of any of these things, if they're bad things or your chances of being able to buy a house by the time you're 30, become the senior vice president by the time you're 40, or any of those ambitions or goals that you might have set for yourself, your chances of being able to achieve those are better than someone else who is in a similar situation in a similar capacity. Why? I don't know. I just, like I think I'll be able to do it. So these are all examples of optimism bias, and now let's look at some more examples on how it's leveraged in day-to-day life and in marketing, and then we'll look at pharma marketing as well. So anybody who is in this class who has themselves tried to lose weight, or knows somebody who is trying to lose weight or has tried to lose weight, there's metadata from many studies where people have been tracked, people who try to follow certain diets, either themselves or commercial diet programs like Weight Watchers and Nutrisystem and whatnot. On average, over a 2-year period, the maximum weight loss from any diet was less than 5 pounds. And yet, when you talk to people who are going on a diet, who are actually preparing to get healthy and lose weight, they all want to lose between 10 to 20 pounds. In many of them, like almost irrespective of how much they weigh today, they want to lose 10 to 20 pounds. So how is it possible that all these times when we have actually tried to lose weight, in many cases people don't lose any weight at all, net they gain it back, or they lose only 1 or 2 pounds. 5 is like the highest. So the average is going to be even lower. But this is all driven by optimism bias, and all the Weight Watchers companies, all the diet foods, they all feed optimism bias in one way or the other to get you to believe you can do it, even though reality might suggest, or past might suggest, most of you can't, unless you fundamentally change things in your life. If you do kind of more or less the same old, the chances that you'll be able to really lose 20 pounds are very, very low. Another example, optimism bias, you might have seen this campaign on TV. Let's look at this quick short commercial.
We asked people all over the country, what's something significant that's happened to you in the last 5 years? Then we asked them what might happen in the next 5 years. The good things were put on yellow magnets, and the bad ones on blue. The results showed us something interesting. Turns out, the past was a pretty even mix of good and bad, yet the future was almost all good things.
So this is a very, very good real-life example featured in a Prudential commercial. Prudential has been quite, over the last few years, they've come up with many different ways to illustrate they are fighting optimism bias, because of optimism bias, a lot of people do not plan for retirement early enough, sufficiently enough, et cetera, et cetera. So in their case, optimism bias is actually creating a very big problem, and they're trying to bring it to people's attention to try and almost very gently show people, nudge people that this is irrational or bad behavior for your own good, and you need to change. But that's very difficult to do. So they've been trying many different ways to communicate this. If you directly say this to anybody, they would immediately go into denial. They would never want to admit to making irrational decisions or being a bad financial, planner for themselves and their family. None of those. They'll immediately go into denial. But these are very subtle nudges or gentle ways to kind of open people's eyes. And you might have seen other executions, either with this professor from Harvard, or even other executions where he's not featured. All of them are fighting optimism bias, and this is a really good illustration of how what you think happened, what you are saying has happened to you in the last 5 years, what you think will happen to you in the next 5. Let's take another example.
Congratulations, you're down with Crestor.
Yes! When diet and exercise aren't enough, adding Crestor lowers bad cholesterol up to 55%.
So this is a Crestor commercial that you might have also seen, or you might have worked on, even whoever, depending on who's attending the class. But this is an example of a commercial where you are actually not like you're feeding optimism bias, not fighting it. You are also not talking about optimism bias like the Prudential commercial was doing. You're actually living it, you're personifying it, you are demonstrating optimism bias. So the choice of music, the protagonist, the actress that they have chosen, the way it has been shot, it's even unrealistically, perhaps, you know, like exuberant or whatever, but it's very much getting someone who has lived for years and decades of high cholesterol, and it's kind of, you know, saying it is what it is, and you know, I give up, right? And nothing worked for me, or so on and so forth, to actually have optimism and hope about the future. Here's another one. Now, the next one is also optimism bias, also feeding optimism bias, but a very different way of doing it.
For adults with advanced non-small cell lung cancer, previously treated with platinum-based chemotherapy, including those with an abnormal ALK or EGFR gene who've tried an FDA-approved targeted therapy, this is big. A chance to live longer with Opdivo.
So now here also, it's very much feeding optimism bias. The way the grand kind of setup with the you know the music that's being used, the expressions on people's faces, they're all trying to, you know, kind of also create that feeling of hope and optimism about the future when you might not have today. So different executions, the same heuristically, the same strategy, feeding optimism bias to get your message across more convincingly, more memorably, more emphatically. So, you know, like the main point in both the commercials is you can now expect results that were not possible before. But if you just say something like that, you know, in a normal way, that may or may not connect with people or have an impact on people. This is basically a more persuasive way. Here, it's not about gentle nudges. These are much harder hitting than the Prudential one, because Prudential was fighting optimism bias. So you almost by definition have to do that gently, tiptoe your way to fighting a bias that people have, otherwise they go into denial. So let's quickly review the two heuristics that we have learned. Background contrast effect basically means you can sometimes irrationally change your assessment of something based on what's in the background. You should ideally just look at you know, whatever you're focused on, you should assess it based on its own merits. It doesn't matter what background it's, you know, it's put against and contrasted against. It should not have an impact on you, but it does, and this is a powerful heuristic to use in marketing. We'll talk on the next slide about, you know, some ideas for where and how you can use it. And there could be, so there's two things. One is, you can create a background to contrast your product against it in a way that leverages your product. You can also, this background contrast effect heuristic could already exist in your disease state, whereby because of the competitive set of brands that exist in the marketplace, or because of the way physicians or patients make treatment decisions, you know, given the disease state, there might already be naturally occurring backgrounds that the physician or the patient is being influenced when they're making decisions, which you, again, might want to take advantage of, i.e. feed, or might want to remove those backgrounds or you know, kind of clarify them or change them to, and that would be equivalent of fighting the heuristic. An optimism bias, and we expect future to be more positive than the past, when even though the data or experiences doesn't suggest it, there's any reason that could be the case. We expect us to do better than others, and there's also not enough evidence to suggest that at many times, and yet we fall into this trap. One of the very commonly used examples of optimism bias is just lottery buying. Lotteries, Americans spend around $70 billion a year on lottery, and they're most motivated by the big lottery tickets. And we all know what the chances of those are. They are very, very low. But we never really, what we don't get to see, or there's very little discussion about, is how the whole lottery system, which is entirely based on irrational optimism bias, is essentially a way to tax the poor and the low-income households who shouldn't really be spending even a single dime on lottery, but yet they spend actually a disproportionate share of their disposable income on it, and states and even the national systems, they take advantage of it. It's almost a really bad policy from a social policy standpoint, but it's a system that's already in place. So these are two heuristics that we discussed today. Let's just quickly give you some ideas on how to use this heuristic, where and depending on what disease state or condition you're working in, what brand you're working in, which stage in the life cycle, etc., where to use this heuristic. And the way we typically present this in every class is, for each heuristic, we'll give you some ideas for physician and patient applications. You're welcome to come back and approach us anytime. There's no cost. If you just want to ask a question about, if I'm facing a situation like this and I'm thinking that this could be background contrast effect, am I thinking correctly? Or, is this a good application? Or how can I use it? We encourage that. So it tells us that people are internalizing the knowledge and the science. For background contrast effect, all of these applications that are listed here, where these are places where you can leverage, these are mostly where you can create a new background for your brand to be contrasted against, and therefore create background contrast effect, feed background contrast effect, where you can leverage superior results, where there's lots of brands in similar classes, competing classes, etc. Whenever you end up working on a brand where there's first-in-class mechanism of action, you can use background contrast effect to your advantage. I mean, everybody knows to talk about first and only class, etc. That's not news. You know that from a marketing, just basic principles already. But how to use background contrast effect to manipulate language to really amplify the impact of that is what we're trying to emphasize. And on the patient side, you can also, like a lot of times, you are trying to communicate copay card benefits, for patients, and either in the absolute or versus competition. You can use background contrast effect for that. You can also, in medical conditions where there's quite a lot of pain points with existing therapies, whether they're all injections or they're not easy to get, or there are lots of side effects, whatever, you can again create backgrounds for you and feed them. Optimism bias, similarly, is going to be very powerful if you're working in therapeutic areas where current therapies often fail, where there's a lot of symptomatic relief that physicians and patients are seeking, where there are risks of medical events or complications or hospitalizations, etc., happening. That's another area where people tend to use optimism bias often, in that they think it's not going to happen to them, it's not going to happen in their practice, it's not going to happen to their hospital, etc. And there you would be fighting optimism bias to better communicate the risk, to get people to better understand what could happen to them if they're a patient or a physician, their practice and their hospital, etc. Wherever for patients, if you're working in a therapeutic area where there's historically low compliance and adherence behaviors, using optimism bias to get people excited about the hope and the optimism of the future, and use that as a way to get better compliance and adherence is also a technique that works very well, and to kind of generate excitement in areas like you saw in Opdivo commercial, where it's kind of like a very grandeur type of setup. You get in areas where there's either not very good solutions, or survival rates are low, or mortality rates are high, things like that. You can use optimism bias to really amplify your message and your communications. So those are the two heuristics for today's class, this completes our class for today. We're at time, but if people have some questions, that they would like to bring up here, please feel to do so. You can also, separately, privately, or later reach out to anybody here and clarify or ask questions.